As part of Invasive Species Week 2022, I'm going to talk a little bit about invasive marine non-native species. So just to introduce myself, I'm Hannah Tidbury. I work for Cefas, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, where I lead the marine non-native species work area. So just to start, what are invasive non-native species? Well, they are animals or plants which have been introduced into locations outside their native range by human activity, where they cause harm to the environment and/or the economy. And just to quote the Convention of Biological Diversity, invasive non-native species are the main direct driver of biodiversity loss across the globe and cost our economies hundreds of billions of dollars globally each year. So I just take this opportunity to highlight a few marine invasive non-native species of concern to us here in the UK and considered priority for monitoring. So the top image there is the carpet sea squirt, Didenum vexillum. This is a tunicate which is native to Japan. In suitable environments, this species can grow really quickly and form carpet-like colonies which smother native habitat species and also artificial substrates. And this can lead to substantial negative impact on ecosystem functioning, including preventing fish and other marine organisms from feeding and successfully breeding. And it can also result in economic loss if commercially grown species are also smothered. Moving on to the centre image. So this is Undaria pinnatifida. This is a brown seaweed which is native to the Pacific. And this species is actually on the 100 World's Worst Invasive Species list, which has been created by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. And this listing is really due to the fact this species can overgrow and exclude native algal species and hugely alter marine food chains and ultimately cause harm to biodiversity. And finally, the bottom image is of the Asian shore crab, Hemagrapsis sanguineus. This is a crab that's native to East Asia, and we consider it high risk really due to the tendency of this crab to form quite highly dense populations, which can displace native species, including those of commercial value. So crucial to understanding invasive species, in particular their threat and how to manage them, is understanding the process of invasion. And this comprises introduction, which in the marine environment is usually via pathways associated with shipping, so the transfer of non-native species via hull fouling or in ballast, recreational boating and water use, so transfer via hull fouling or in bilge water or on contaminated equipment or clothing, or through the ornamental and aquaculture industries, so through escapes or deliberate releases. If conditions are suitable, these introduced species may become established, so they may reproduce, and subsequently spread to new locations and ultimately cause impact, so become invasive. And how we manage these invasive species depends on where in the invasive process they are. So before a species is introduced, prevention of its introduction is very much the focus of management. If the species has been introduced already, then the management shifts to focus on monitoring and rapid response to prevent establishment of the species and its onward spread. And for those species that are established and have spread, the focus of management really is around long-term control to minimise those impacts. Prevention of introduction is very much seen as the most cost-effective approach to managing invasive species, and this is particularly true in open systems such as the marine environment, where containment and eradication is very challenging. So when we refer to prevention of introduction, we're primarily talking about biosecurity measures which target pathways of invasive species introduction. So some examples of these measures include biosecurity campaigns. So one great example is the hugely successful Check Clean Dry campaign. So this is a campaign which provides clear actions that recreational water users can take to reduce the risk of transferring invasive species on their boats, equipment or clothes. There's also pathway action plans. So most relevant to the marine environment is the angling and recreational boating pathway action plan that's been developed and implemented by the Secretariat. There's also species-specific action plans and event biosecurity plans. So, for example, there may be a biosecurity plan created for a boating gala where lots of boats and equipment are coming to one location from many other locations, presenting a risk of introduction or spread of an invasive species. And of course, there's also legal tools which function to prevent the introduction of marine invasive species under particular circumstances. So these may include restrictions on import or trade and keeping of certain species. However, despite all these different tools and approaches being employed, invasive non-native species introduction into UK marine waters still do occur. And I'm just going to talk through a couple of quite recent examples of unexpected invasive species introductions and reports, the actions that we took in response to these, and opportunities to reduce the risk of such events occurring in the future. So the first example I want to touch on briefly is the mass release of American lobsters that's occurred off the south coast of England in 2015. So more specifically, greater than 300 American lobsters were released in June 2015 off the coast of Brighton, and this was part of a religious ceremony called a life release. So why were we worried about this mass release event? Well, as their name suggests, American lobsters are not naturally occurring in UK waters. In fact, they naturally occur on the Atlantic coast of North America. So from Labrador in Canada down to North Carolina in the United States. And risk assessments conducted for the UK concluded that this species was high risk, and a recent invasive species horizon scan exercise concluded that American lobsters were one of the top 30 biggest future invasive species threats, and in terms of marine species, they were in the top 5. And these high risk kind of conclusions stem from the fact that this invasive species can have huge impacts on native species and ecosystems, including commercial species. And these impacts really stem from the fact that the American lobster can introduce disease or alter genetics of native species, and of course compete with native species for food and habitat. While the American lobster had occasionally been reported in UK waters prior to 2015, they were at quite low numbers. So this mass release event in 2015 was of concern, both from an ecological perspective, but also an economic perspective, given their potential impact on commercial fisheries. So of course, referring back to our invasion process and the management approaches taken, in this instance, introduction had already occurred, so management actions focused on the monitoring and rapid response element, and this was really to try and minimise the risk of the species becoming established and spreading further. So very much in line with this, the actions taken here were firstly to determine how far away the animal could travel from the site of release, and this was really with a view to employing effort to catch as many animals as possible and remove them from the water as soon as possible. And this was very much a collaborative response across key organisations, including DEFRA, the Marine Management Organisation, Cefas and others. So that was the kind of short-term response, but in the longer term, we wanted to do something to aid ongoing control to mitigate the consequence of this release event. And with the support of DEFRA, Marine Management Organisation, and the IFCAs, so the Inshore Fisheries Conservation Authorities, Cefas led the development of a retain and report campaign for England, and this was launched in 2020. So a little bit more about that campaign. So essentially the campaign comprised awareness raising material in the form of a poster and a leaflet, and these contained key information. So information around the ID of the American lobster, so key morphological features, and specifically how the American lobster differs to our native lobster. Other information was included around impacts, so really to raise awareness of why this campaign had come to light and why it was important that the animal was retained and reported. And obviously, crucially, this awareness raising material included information on what to do with an animal once it was found, who to report it to, so those lines of action. So this was a really successful campaign in England, and actually subsequently a very similar campaign has been launched in Scotland and also Northern Ireland. So the second example I wanted to talk about relates to a report of a lionfish caught by an angler off Chesil Beach in Dorset in the south coast of England. And this was a report in September 21. It hit social media and then was quite rapidly picked up by the press with quite dramatic headlines, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, the lionfish was not retained, so the report of the catch couldn't be validated or investigated further. Just a little bit more information about the lionfish. So, why were we concerned about the catch of a lionfish in UK waters? Well, again, the species is not native to UK. It's native to the Western Indo-Pacific and the Red Sea. It has been introduced across the Caribbean and the Mediterranean already, and it is causing huge issues both ecologically and economically. And this is really due to its ability to reach huge numbers, and it preys on native species, some of which are very commercially valuable species, and it can really cause huge damage to key ecosystems and their function, and in those introduced ranges, this includes coral reef ecosystems. In contrast to the response to the lobster release, where we knew the species was high risk, the response to this lionfish catch was more about getting a better understanding of what risk this species posed to UK waters. Again, this response was across different agencies. So the first thing we did was to determine the distribution of lionfish around Europe, in particular Northern Europe, where the climate is similar to the UK. Second, we carried out a temperature suitability assessment, and this was really to check whether the temperature of UK waters would allow the lionfish to survive and breed, given its temperature tolerances. So the outputs of the suitability assessment highlighted that UK waters are too cold to support survival or establishment of lionfish, and this conclusion was further supported by the absence of the species outside the Mediterranean. So taken together, this initial response led us to conclude that the lionfish caught was likely to be a lone animal, most likely an animal that had outgrown its aquarium and had been released or dumped near the catch site around Chesil Beach. So just two examples presented here, but they do really highlight the continuing threat posed by invasive species to UK waters. In particular, these two examples highlight the potential threat posed by deliberate release. So in terms of key messages to take forward, I guess the first would be around the need for continued and increased awareness raising and communication of risks, in particular risks of the impact of deliberate releasing an invasive species, and some supportive, proactive messaging about what one should do instead. And this is very much something that is supported by those working on invasive species, and there are projects currently underway that aim to improve communication around invasive species, in particular the deliberate release of aquatic invasive species. So watch this space. The second message really is around the need for clear and consistent messaging around reporting routes. Again, this is something that's very much supported by those working in the area. And this really stems from the fact that the sooner we know of a species introduction, the sooner we can act accordingly. And that very much leads me on to my final message, which is to highlight the route by which marine invasive non-native species can be reported. And that is via the iRecord platform or the alert non-native @ceh.ac.uk email. And these are both supported by the Biological Records Centre. And I've provided a link there to one of the Non-Native Species Secretariat pages, which provides really helpful information on how to report invasive species. So that just leaves me to thank you all very much for listening, and of course if you do have any questions or would like any further information, please do get in touch, and you can do so via the email nns@cefas.co.uk. Thanks very much.